Hello, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate all of you coming out in the evening. Definitely know that many of you worked all day and have families to get to and everything else, but we appreciate that your commitment to this topic of family engagement is as huge as ours is. And so thank you again. Just a couple of notes. My name's Robin Ryan, and I am with the Sacramento County Office of Education, and specifically the Seeds of Partnership contract. But we've partnered together with our other coworkers at Sac County Office of Education to offer some family and community engagement workshops and summits that are coming up. So I just want to say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to introduce Superintendent Gordon. So based on the need from our local districts and in your interest in more professional learning related to family engagement, we've pulled together and come up with some summits and some workshops specific to this topic. And so in response to that, you know, it's been pretty huge. And we have already had a summit earlier this year, and this is our very first workshop. And so thank you for being a part of that. And we have another workshop that was scheduled for the 9th, so in October, so if any of you signed up for that, please know that one's being rescheduled, and we'll get that information to you, so put that on your notes. And we have an upcoming summit that is in, I want to make sure I get the date right, November 1st, 8 to 3, Steve Constantino and 2 other workshops, and that's in collaboration with Scholastic. So many of you might know Steve Constantino. We had the pleasure of seeing him, and he's an outstanding speaker. So we hope you all will sign up on the Go Sign Me Up and join us. So we have a renewed focus here with our family and community engagement efforts, and the Sac County Office of Education Board and of course the administration this is a primary focus. And so thank you so much for being a part of it, and look forward to seeing more things rolling out from our group. So we appreciate you coming. I want to introduce Superintendent Gordon, and then he'll introduce our speaker.
I just want to welcome you, and I want to thank everybody for coming out. And as Robin said, this effort is a big priority for our County Board of Education. We've got a couple of very active parents on the board, and one of their big priorities is making sure that the work we do is not only understandable to our parent community, but also that they can take action to help us and stand beside us and work with us. And related to that is an effort on the part of our board to also try to amplify youth voice. Because we think when we talk about family and community engagement, often we think of, well, parent engagement. But really, I think we miss a bet by not doing a lot more to engage our young people. Even though they may be 4th, 5th, or 6th graders, they can give us a lot of feedback that's useful to us. And I think in our efforts to promote civic engagement in general, we're really trying to reach out to our young people to assist us, and most of all, to understand the democratic values that we have in this country and their importance to them as individuals. And just to give you a quick example of that, on November 2nd, the day after the next summit, we are having a youth summit right here in this very room, where we're trying to bring young people together from all over the county, and not just the high-performing students who typically might get involved, the type of kids who do mock trial and moot court and so on, but all of our kids from the community school, kids from our alternative schools. And they're going to come as teams, and they're going to focus on 3 current issues that they're trying to find ways to become engaged in and become involved in and really pitch in and help out. So topic 1 is the census. How can our young people help in our communities facilitate adults completing the census? For the first time this year, the census is going to be completed online. So think about that. That's going to be a problem for a lot of our families, particularly older people who are not used to using the computer. Secondly, they can help out because they speak the language of their friends and neighbors and families. So that'll be number one. Number two will be voter registration, which has been going on for several years. The state gave us the ability to register 16-year-olds in high school so they can be able to vote when they turn 18. And then the final one is there's a group of students who are planning a mental health summit, a youth mental health summit. And they're trying to put this together to promote more mental health support and services in the schools, and we'll be working with them. So again, I think today we're going to talk about support for our communities around English learners. And obviously, we have about 20% or so of our kids in the county who are English learners. We have many, many, many refugee students, as you know, in our community. And I think today's session will give you some real insights into working with that community. But our presenter is not just talking about working with English learners. Our presenter is really talking in the broadest sense about, again, family and community engagement. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our presenter today, who is Graciela Garcia Torres, who is one of our outstanding SCOE curriculum specialists. So let me welcome Graciela. Please give her a nice hand.
Family and community engagement is an area that is very close to my heart, not only because I am a lifelong English learner. I've been reclassified many years ago, and I've been studying English for more than 30 years. With that said, I did work with ELACs and DLAC, and so as a principal, I also experienced great success with my community, and in terms of ensuring that they have a voice. And so today's presentation is around supporting our families and supporting ourselves. It's more about the personal process. So probably because you're sitting with your teams or with people that you normally see, maybe not, you probably already know each other's name, right? So one other thing in terms of engaging families is have them introduce themselves, having them feel welcome, and know that, it is one of the most important aspects is about our name, right? It is the one sound that it makes resonates with us immediately and calls our attention. So this is a wonderful quote in terms of how our name and there's importance in terms of how we say the name and how we practice those names. So I'll just say there is a national movement about My Name, My Identity campaign because of the whole importance of saying the student's name and saying it correctly. So one way to really engage the family is how their child feels in the school system, right? So we want to make sure that we keep that in back of our minds. These are the norms that we have for today that I'd like for us to, see about agreeing. So one is that, we will be talking about several perspectives, right? Because like I said, it's a personal process, so personal journey. So we will be sharing and hearing from each other, and we want to hear with positive intent. The other is that we will use respectful words when in disagreement. So if we disagree, it's okay to say that I disagree, but we want to keep it in a very respectful and positive manner, as well as seeing it from a welcoming perspective or as a contribution for the different way that that person sees or feels about situations, right? Because we will be doing a reflection, and these activities are meant for you to be able to duplicate them. Okay, so if you work with staff and you think about, it's like a train the trainer, so you'll have the material so that if you want to take it and tweak it and say, I want to do this with my staff, then you're able to do that. But the process is a personal process, and then you venture in terms of getting your families involved. So this is our learning intention. So we recognize the value of building bridges, okay? From cultural and linguistic diverse families. We recognize that there is a need, and we recognize that we have different perspectives, right? this is the first part that you have on your learning intentions in terms of on your note-taking guide. And we feel that if you can do one of these success criteria that we have listed, we have been successful. This is success criteria is at the end we will revisit and see what you might have gotten out of it. I'd like to show a video of definition of culture by the, I never say this word right, but here we go. It's the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Bureau, thank you. Okay, see, we need occasional support as learning English, so thank you for that. Okay, so here is this video. It's a 30-second video, and it's just with sound and with letters, okay? So it has sentences to understand more about, put a context, and this is about the exchange program and getting people to study abroad, okay? Any thoughts about what you saw in terms of what is culture?
I think that sometimes we can see culture as maybe ethnic makeup or a color of your skin. So to see those definitions be very universal and open, it was like, yeah, that's what it's about.
Okay, thank you. Very neat. Okay, very nice. Thank you for that perspective. Okay, so we will keep, talking more about culture, and you do have areas in the note-taking guide to explore more about what you see of what culture is. But just before we go there, I wanted to share with you some information. So you heard Superintendent Gordon talk about our 20% of English learners in the county. So this graphic here shows our enrollment of language acquisition status. In other words, in terms of how many students are English learners, how many are initially fluent proficient, how many are reclassified as fluent proficient. And so we see that we have the numbers here on the side in terms of how many of our students are actually in the category of having a language other than English at home or in some way or shape. If they are initially fluent, that means that their parents have a language other than English. So if we do the math with the millions on the side with 1 million, we would end up, if I did the math right, it would be 2,637,321 students that would have a language other than English at home in terms of how they interpret. And so notice how the culture is intertwined with language, so it's important to note that. Then the other is in terms of what are the representations of languages in California. And so this is 2017-18 data, but you see here that out of our group from English learners, Spanish is 82.19%. And these 5 languages are the predominant in the state. So when you see translations, you will almost always see translations in what language out of the state? Spanish. Okay, and so this puts in perspective in terms of why we need to have translations for Spanish. And then the other is, notice how we have the other 4 languages listed. And so Vietnamese and Mandarin and Arabic and Filipino. So when the state says that they are going to provide translations for the top 5 languages, this is what they're basing their reasoning behind it in terms of why we're going to support our students our families and our communities in terms of those languages, okay? That makes sense? Okay, then the other is, because Spanish is the predominant language, I wanted to include this quote from the ELD framework on Chapter 9 about access and equity that speaks about English learners and profiles them in terms of understanding the diversity that exists among this student group, and also because many of our Spanish speakers, they speak Pocho or they speak Chicano English, right? Or they, we say they speak Spanglish. So the framework does a fine job at really looking at this from a different perspective. And it basically says that the way that our students speak and the way that they're using language, it's part of their social linguistic asset, meaning that it is sophisticated in terms of how they switch and how they create those sentences, okay? And they do a nice job in this chapter also talking about African American students and African American vernacular, because it comes to that mindset or that thinking to frame it. And so that instead of us spending our time in school saying, that's bad English, it's more about how do we pick up on this asset that the students are using, this linguistic knowledge and using the language appropriately in order for them to make meaning, because it is part of who they are, okay? And it's part of how they socialize and understand life and interact with one another. Then here is another data point in terms of where do the English learners come from, or they immigrate, right? And again, we're working with 2017-18 data released from the CalPADS, or our system with the California Department of Education that we look to in order for us to make meaning of this data. And so you notice that the top 5 countries where we see students are from Mexico, El Salvador, China, India, and the Philippines. And so within, some numbers of students, we have 37,000 approximately are from Mexico, and then 15,000 from El Salvador. We have 14,000 from China and 12,000 from India, okay? And from the Philippines, we have about 10,000 plus students according to that data. Okay, and I'd like to make a connection to the census, and because one of the other things about the census, it's our communities understanding the importance of being counted. And so one of those processes is that they'll receive a card that will have the information about going online and being counted. And one way to avoid having somebody knock on their door is respond to that card, and actually going online and responding to the census. And so that's key information in terms of, the families having to understand that, okay? Because that's important to understand in this time. Okay, and then in terms of culture and English learners, I wanted to also share this quote, ELD framework, and it's again the Chapter 9 on access and equity that speaks to the diverse and the range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds and the experiences, as well as the proficiency that the students come with in their primary language. Sometimes they don't speak their primary language anymore, but it's still part of how they mix their understanding of and make sense for their schooling, and how they have social economic statuses that are very broad and different in terms of what we understand. And so these are important to take into consideration when we are interacting with the families, right? Okay, then I have other data, and this one you get to participate. Haha, that's the fun part. So I have 2 data sets here, okay? And this is from our California dashboard, and this is how we do our accountability, right? We get colors on the dashboard, and now we are able to see how our schools are doing in a more broader sense. So on this side, we have graduation rate in terms of our English learners, okay? So I'd like for you to take a look at what this is. So on the red is they're on the low, or the very low end in terms of graduation rate. On the green is high, and then on the blue is very high, okay? And so you notice that we have, this is actual data from a district that is predominant with English learners, and not here in Sacramento County. But I wanted, it does show trends in terms of when you look at data in various districts that have a high school, it's very common to see this data. In terms of graduation rate, they don't have, they actually in places have the lowest graduation rate or a lower graduation rate, similar to foster youth and students with disabilities, okay? And then chronic absent, they are actually one of the groups that has better attendance, okay? So what does that tell us about English learners in general terms? They're coming to school. And guess what? They also behave, for the most part. I didn't want to pull the suspension rate, but for the most part, right? So if they're coming to school, but then they're dropping out of high school, okay? And so that's something to consider in terms of what's going on. Our classroom or our school settings and climates, and how are their families being engaged, so that then, we work around this data and support them to graduate, okay, at a higher rate. Okay, and so, as I wanted to frame that as setting the urgency. I know you have the urgency because you're here, right? But just to give you a little bit more. So I'd like to have us dive into two documents. Well, they're not. I'm giving you just the frames for these documents. We have on this side, we have the California English Learner Roadmap, which is policy, okay? So for 20 years, we did not have policy of English learners. And in 2017, the California Department of Education decided to have a group of educators, English learners, come up with what do we want out of this policy in terms of thinking, the new ways of thinking about our English learners and utilizing all the research and resources that we have at hand. So, and then the other document is SEL, right? So we have, the California Department of Education has launched an initiative about social emotional learning and the importance that carries for our students in terms of being part of a community and feeling that they belong. So with that, the English Learner Roadmap is basically the information and resources that are available to assist our LEAs or districts and charters to engage in continuous improvement and to advance outcomes for English learners, their families, and their communities. So they have written 4 principles and 17 elements that go with that. Today, I'm just going to have you look through the principles. We did give you copies of some of the elements with the rubric, but we're not going to go into that. We want to at least give you some of that frame. Bless you. And then with the social emotional learning guiding principles, there are also, how many principles are there? 5, I believe, yes. 5 principles with social emotional guiding documentation. And so what I'd like for us to do is, I'd like for you to, at your tables you have a yellow copy that has the one that I'd like for you to use for the EL roadmap. And so the first page, one side of the EL roadmap gives you the vision and mission, and then it gives you more information about it. If you want to read that, that's fine, but for the sake of this activity, I'd like for you to go to the 4 principles and of the EL roadmap and the SEL principles, put them side by side for you to engage in this individual activity, and then we'll have time to work with each other, okay? As you put them side by side and read one and then the other, I'd like for you to find 3 interwoven concepts between the policy, the ELR or English Learner Roadmap, and the initiative of social emotional learning. Okay, so just find 3 connections that come with that. So, for example, with the English Learner Roadmap, we talk about languages and cultures of the students and how that asset that they bring to the home, and that's English Learner Roadmap Principle 1. And with the SEL, SEL Principle 2, it talks about committing to equity for all students. And how with that equity needs to be personalized, it needs to be intentional, and it needs to address the implicit biases, and it needs to address the assets that the students bring. So that would be maybe one interconnection between these two, one policy, the other one initiative, okay? So I'd like for you to look through those and find how many? Three, okay. And then I'd like for you to think about your work and your role as what you do, as whether you are a community liaison or a principal, or what other positions do we have? Coordinator, TOSA, okay, so there's several positions. So think about how that connects to your work, and if you can think about one action that maybe it leads to, I'm going to share this with somebody else, that's one action. And they do say that if within the first 7 years, sometimes if we don't do something after you learn, then maybe you won't do it, okay? And I'm sorry, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I will. On your note-taking guide, you have the space on page 2 to write down your 3, 2, 1, okay? All right. Okay, so what I'd like to ask you to share with another person. So we're going to have you find a partner from another table. So I'm going to ask that you do get up. All you need with you is your note-taking guide with your notes. And we're going to do a 2-minute exchange. And so the way that will look, and I'll be your timer. I mean your timekeeper and timer. And so one person will share what they found, the 3 interwoven concepts between the policy of English Learner in the English Learner Roadmap and the initiative of the social emotional principles, and the connections to your context in terms of what you do. So this will give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and say, this is my position, this is what I do. And then the one action that you decided to take after doing this activity, this exercise. Any questions about that? Okay, you will find your own partners. So, and then remember that the protocol that I use is the chime. So when you hear that, it's time to, I will tell you now it's time to switch. And so how many minutes do you have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes per person, okay? Any questions? Okay, so make eye contact with your partner, and then we should all stand up, and you're coming back to your seat. So that's all you need to take.
Cool.
Okay.
So what did you come with?
I found kind of the partnership with families between these two. I just did between SEL and there. I found, using evidence and data to guide instruction and decision making between these two. Mm-hmm. And then these two, I was looking at just a whole child, talking about from preschool all the way up and in all areas, including community and post-secondary options and things like that. So they had some similarities to me on those ones.
Cool.
And then connections to my contacts as a refugee coordinator, the importance of partnership with families, which is what we're doing. I'm doing parent-teacher home visits with families to find out what do you need, like what are we doing well, what do we need to do, so that's the importance. And then success in school and community.
Yes.
And based on that, I want to ask more questions about SEL with my families. We're focused a lot on what is the school doing, but what about them outside of school? So I think that's the focus. I need to make sure I'm addressing all of their needs, right? Asking questions about those.
Okay, very neat. Now, is there an idea that somebody would like to share in terms of what somebody's going to do in the next 72 hours? Anyone that says, hey, this is a great idea of the 72 hours window and action somebody's going to take? Yes?
Deep conversation and what we can do to help the English learners. So kind of like just go for it and do it, yeah.
Right, and so then how many of your districts are really working into the social emotional learning and they have that interwoven in your system? Good. And so part of this work, and somebody else said it beautifully, is that we don't see it as two separate, right, situations in terms of what we're asking people to do, but there is a lot of interconnectedness in terms of how we want to connect with students and ensure that we have their families also involved in the process, okay? Very good, thank you. And so moving along, you do have this in your note-taking guide, and what I'd like for you to do is notice how from this information in terms of the primary medium of culture is language, right? It is part of our process in terms of how we think and in terms of how we process information. And then this gives us some anchoring information in terms of how a child or adult processes his or her unique values. The beliefs and everyday experiences are in terms of child rearing conventions, and it's mediated through their primary or home language. Thus, in a learning environment that we create in the schools that increases the connection between the home and the school culture, students can benefit from these 4 things that are listed here. Okay, so I'd like for you to take a moment and look through. You have this piece of writing in your note-taking guide, and underline the key words for you in terms of what is something that I want to remember in terms of is the use of the home language and culture, especially in the instruction of English learners. What is something that ties to and connects to what you see happening in your connected in your work? Okay. So, as part of understanding what these means and making connections to the work is, so how does this transfer into the actions of the adults, right, that lead to connecting what the students will thrive in an environment where the adults, the most important adults in their life, as well as the adults in the school system are working together. And so it is a challenge, right? There are many aspects to consider. And one of those aspects is understanding the culture in terms of at a deeper level, right? And so this iceberg shows a nice image in terms of what we see on the surface, and that would be explicit, and then what we don't necessarily see. And what's implicit is about the relationships that we have with the families, that they will open up to give us more of that implicit. And because of those relationships and conversations that we have at a deeper level, we are able to learn, or by observation. And so let's think about some of these, right? So we have at the top, which is explicit, and we can make assumptions. That's the danger of what's explicit, right? Because we tend to want to make meaning based on what we know. And so it's the caution here is, what assumptions do we make based on how somebody dresses, about their religion or their values and their culture? Bless you. Some of the activities that we do in the school system with families could be more on the explicit, right? In terms of the food, the fun and the fiesta, right? They're easier to deal with in a broader sense. But then there are the implicit, and the implicit, it's really about how do you know about how that family is organized if it's not through the relationship, right? Or through digging deeper in terms of understanding about who they are and what they stand for, how they govern themselves, like who has the authority in the home. Sometimes we make assumptions that in Latino families it's always the male predominant. Well, not all families per se, right? Like if you come to my home, my children will tell you, yo soy la jefa, right? They will tell you, dad does whatever I say. Not all the time, but that's, we just let them feel that way. But we're very, and so it's not always, right? It's not always the case. We always have situations where it's not the main way that people behave. In terms of how do these implicit messages that are part of the culture, because schools also have cultures. And the way that the school exhibits in terms of who and what they celebrate is it's the implicit value that they put in that then shows up as explicit in terms of how it's perceived and how it's experienced by the students and by the parents in terms of them knowing or feeling that they are welcome or not necessarily so welcome. Okay, so these are some values to consider in terms of that area. And what I'd like to have us do is explore more with your own culture, right? And so in terms of, I'd like for you to think about, and on page 3 of your note-taking guide, I've included these questions, right, for you to write down. So for example, in terms of, if I were to say, what is your culture? I think of my culture as Latina and Mexican, so I would just write that. And then in terms of what do you value from your culture, I want you to think about internally in terms of what do you, in your home, right? I value from my culture the respect and the family environment and the value in family. And so what is it that I want others to understand about my culture is that I want others to understand that my culture treats each other with a lot of cariño. Cariño is a word that doesn't necessarily exist in English because it's more of a concept and it's about the love, right? So it's about how maybe you say somebody's very personable, but it's the cariño that you give each other and you see each other in the eye, you kiss each other, you express yourselves like, hola, haven't seen you in a long time, that kind of thing, and you maybe just saw them the day before. That kind of, that's something that and because sometimes it could be, I exhibit that cariño sometimes with my colleagues or when I was a classroom teacher with my students, so I had to really learn about, just the whole aspect of how I demonstrated that and staying true to my culture with also understanding the Magna culture. So, and then is my value of my culture, is it an implicit aspect or an explicit one? The one that I share with you. It's implicit, right? It's not, you can't see that. It's part of, you would have to know more about me and interact with me and build a relationship to see that. So I'd like for you to think about yourself, and then you have the space on the page to write it down, okay? All right. So let's take 2 minutes to do that. So finish your sentence, and I'd like you to keep this aspect in mind as we bridge to the next. And you also have these questions on that same page. And so this one, I'd like for you to think about an elbow partner and talk with each other about this, because by making the connection in terms of your culture and appreciating your culture, it's always a way to appreciate the cultures of others and think about how might you build a bridge for a newcomer, right? Or what are those things that you do or have done? So in San Juan, for example, they have a video series that they have created for newcomer families, and so they have it in Farsi, Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, and you do have that resource on the resources list at the very end. I have that link. I didn't ask them for permission, but I don't think that they will mind. The other is in terms of, how do we open the door to other cultures? So, one way is, are there conversations about the diversity of your school and who these students are and how they might do cultural events or aspects of what they value? And as part of the professional learning norms and development, or is it, how does this conversation in connection to your culture might impact, what you take might impact how you take the next steps, okay? So with an elbow partner, please, just talk about those topics that are here, or any one of those topics in terms of how you connect and help others connect. And then we'll come back as a whole group, okay?
And you see it in practice because...
So yes, at our district, we do have a refugee program, and they have different school community resource assistants that speak Farsi, Dari, Pashto, and Arabic. And one way I believe that they do support and build that bridge is by providing those videos that she mentioned in their language. We have translators within just literally across the hall that they come, and so they do speak, their language. That itself does build that bridge. Yes, these are school employees, yeah. So we have translators, and then we also have the school community resource assistants that also speak the language. And also by providing like a brochure in the language, that just, I feel like, builds that connection as well. I think that different ways that they may build that relationship, like I said, maybe getting some handouts, just to have it already, and a little brief introduction of yourself. I'm not sure if you heard of it's a telephone line. It used to be through AT&T. I'm not sure what it's called, but it's a translation line that a district can invest in. And you pick up the phone, you say the language, and then they pretty much contact the family. You're on the phone as well, and that can serve as a way. And building connections with teachers, principals, maybe holding like a teacher principal donut morning, and if you do have maybe someone else that does speak the language, maybe having them there, like even another student, just building that community connection as well.
We should do this if we agree, huh? Yes, let's get some action in here. Good. Okay, very neat. So I'd have this quote, and you heard Robin talk about Steve Constantino coming here on November 1st. And he said this quote at a session that I attended many years ago. And I was a classroom teacher, but it made such an impact. And I was teaching world history, English, ELA, and Spanish in middle school. So I put this up in my class because middle schoolers, right? Who has experience with middle schoolers? Yes, they're at a very pivotal time of their life where they're trying to make meaning and gain independence from their families. But then sometimes they're 3 years old, and sometimes they're like, who knows how old they are. But in terms of beliefs and values dictate actions, right? What do you believe? What do you value? And we mainly use that in terms of in talking about history, and because they would always ask me, I would bring the two perspectives and try to find as much literature that was authentic, like in the Mexican-American War, get the perspective of United States, and then get the perspective of Mexico, and then they would read about it, and they would say, my teacher, maestra, which one is the true? So I would like, well, what do you think, right? We need to be thinkers about that. So as we connect to today, I have selected an activity for us to dive into that conversation, right? And so notice in the norms, I said we will be talking about our beliefs, and we will be respectful to one another in terms of how we see and perceive some of those beliefs. So in your note-taking guide, page 4, you have an outline. So teaching tolerance has many, many tools. Right? It's one that I used when I was in the classroom, and I continue to go to those sources. In the past, they used to send us, what is that, DHS, those big old tapes? Yes, so what was that, the VHS and the VCR? Yes, okay. So in the past, they used to send those to us for us to use it in the classroom for free. Okay, they don't do that anymore because now it's all web-based, and you can download a lot of information and whatnot. So within that resource, I found this common belief survey, okay? And so it's a common belief in terms of our school system that maybe you hear, maybe it's about how we interact with the families and the students. And I selected, out of the 13 that are available, I selected 5 for the purpose of our time together. And so you have, so I'd like for you to read the statement, and I have matched the statement number, so it doesn't start with number 1. It says 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 11, because remember I selected 5, but I wanted to give you the original number so that you have that, and then you do have a handout that I will walk you through to get through later. But right now, I'd like for you to take a moment to read the statement, and then give it a scale in terms of, do you strongly agree? So that would be a 1 with this statement. Are you in the middle, like you neither agree nor disagree, or disagree? And then a 5 is you disagree strongly, okay? So if you want to make your own scale, go ahead. If that makes you happy, it's fine. If you say, I'm neither here, I'm a 2. Okay, fine, so put a 2 on there. And then I'd like you to explore with a why, like what makes you, why is it that you feel that way? And it doesn't have to be a full sentence. You can just write one bullet statement, and so that I'd like for you to do that on your own, and then we will talk about the next steps, okay, in terms of where to go for what this common belief is, and give some context in terms of what the resource says and research says about that, and how this common belief comes to be, before we move on to the next steps. Any questions? We're good? Okay. All right. Thank you. I see that most of you have finished, so I will go ahead and explain the next step. In your folders, you have a blue handout that has the 5 selected beliefs. I'd like for you to select one of the 5 to discuss with a partner, okay? So I'd like for you to, first share about first select the one, and then share how you felt about it, strongly believe or not strongly believe, and why. But then I want you to go to the excerpt here, find that belief, read about it, okay, to give you context in terms of how this relates to why is it a common belief, and what is the context that says in terms of the research done around it, okay? Each one of these has questions to consider. You do not have to do the questions to consider, but if you have the time within your conversation, I'd like for you to focus on sharing the belief, making the context for you and your partner, and then building the knowledge from this resource. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so your elbow partner, we have about 5 minutes, and then that's our ticket to dinner. How's that? Okay, all right, thank you. Okay.
One, I feel that
It wasn't fair.
it's not fair because, yes, they are learning English. However, academically, they can be excelling or need more challenging in math or in science. And if we provide students with their primary language, then they're able to get that and not give them, boring work or just because they need the English skills or they need the English language. So that's why I think that I did not agree with.
I think I put depends. So I put here depends. I just thought back to when I used to sit with, as an instructional assistant, I used to sit with English learners, and some just at different levels that the students were in. Some really needed a lot more challenging work, while others were, came from a different, environment, and they just needed a little basic work. So I just kind of was like, oh, okay, maybe it depends. Maybe some need that extra push, and maybe some just need start them at A, I guess, if you will.
I think
So I don't know.
just as any other student in a class, you would differentiate their
levels,
work.
yeah.
So, but if you know that they are academically capable, then give them that work or challenging work in their primary language.
Yeah, that's true.
That's what I felt on that one.
Okay. Which one should we? That was the number 6. What other one do you want to talk about? What about this one where it says number 4? This one was interesting to me too. It says, in some cultures, students are embarrassed to speak in front of others. So I take this into account and don't call on these students in class. Kind of like the number 6. What did you put? I put, it depends. You should talk to students one-on-one and see why. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe they feel like they shouldn't be talking, or maybe it's something you can help them and guide them through. Maybe they are embarrassed and they just need, to talk to you and get some advice, I guess.
I right away just said, well, I'm not going to assume, because, there's some cultures where, we've read or we've heard that, oh, they don't look up at you or they don't do this or that. But I feel that, just as people might assume things of my culture, like I don't think that's necessarily true, so I wouldn't want to not call on students because I think that they're embarrassed for speaking up. So I would want to give that opportunity for students to speak. Yeah, but I mean, I guess I would have to really look into that or ask or find out if.
Because it's important to acknowledge every single student, and whether it's, you know, a nod or a response you get from them, or a whole sentence, or a whole whatever, you know, you still need to acknowledge every single one of your students. So.
And again, it goes back to also just in any other classroom, let's pretend there were, you know, well, I guess I was kind of thinking back on the English, on the not speaking the language. But yeah, I would just want to find out why it is that they're not speaking up. But I wouldn't necessarily assume.
Yeah.
And just never call on them.
No assumptions.
I wanted to share this video. It's a 1-minute video by Linda Darling Hammond. Now, Linda Darling Hammond is an educator with very reputable type of resources and knowledge in terms of education, but currently she is the State Board of Education president. And so I thought it would be important for us to hear what her perspective is, and this is part of a video resource that is in the National Educators Association handbook for involving families. And so I'm going to fast forward to the area where I want the message for the purpose of today's topic, okay, that it's associated with that. But it's a great video.
In their racial, ethnic, cultural context, as well as understood in ways that are not limiting them by virtue of stereotypes. It's very important when you come into a school or a classroom, and I do this all the time myself. I look at the walls and I say, what kind of pictures are up there? What kind of representations are here about who belongs, about who's part of the curriculum, about what we're doing here? All of those kinds of things create a context within which people say, am I a member of this classroom or this school, or am I marginal to this enterprise? So those signals are extremely important. And then all the ways that that plays out in assignments, in discourse, in all of the aspects of education is also very important. So we're not going to get to a more equitable schooling system without understanding and dealing with issues of race, as well as class and language and ethnicity in this country.
Quite a perspective, right? So, and she is the president of the California State Board of Education. So that's that would be an important message for us. Okay, so we have one more activity before we end our session today. Okay, all right. John Hattie, he focuses on influences that yield to the highest degree of impact on student achievement. Okay, so he has ranked these influences and related them to learning from very, very positive effects to negative effects. Okay, so you see this barometer in terms of when there is a strategy or any part of action in terms of how we interact with students that have a negative effect, low, medium, and then this is the high zone, or somebody's phone, shall we down? Is the zone of desired effects, okay? And so, so knowing and understanding the different influences in terms of homework or in terms of how we interact with the classroom and the student engagement is part of that process. So one other, how I want to associate that with the parental involvement and how we perceive that in the schools. So this other visual shows this zone, right? So a 0.4 effect is the zone where we want to be in terms of the zone of desired effects, because it's where we see more growth and better connection in terms of how the students will have outcomes. A zone that is 0.8 is really gives the students that 1 year's worth of growth, okay? And so I wanted to put that barometer in perspective because in an article published by the ASCD, so it's the Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development magazine, okay, on educational leadership, okay? They have an article about the power of parental expectations, okay? And how the parent involvement starts and ends with powerful messages, okay? So we do a lot of work to engage parents, like make sure that they come to meetings, or also in terms of the homework aspect, that they check the homework and that they talk to their kids. And those actions, in terms of what we ask the parents to do, have an influence. And they, you know, so if we go back to this 0.18, 0.18, right, will be in terms of here, that it has effects. It has a positive effect for parents to be involved. But the one aspect that is a 0.7 in terms of a highest effect is those, remember those implicit that we don't get to see, is the parent expectations and how they are formulated and given to the child in terms of they have high hopes for their children. They communicate that in terms of what they expect and how they want them to interact with the school system. And so putting that value is a great way to have that effect size for how our students, so with that said, right, it's not necessarily how we understand it, but because it leads us to how do we build that relationship with the parents so that then we can work with them on this high expectation, right, that they have for their children, and that we work as a partner and see them and respect them in terms of that aspect of partnership, okay? So, you know, in terms of that, there is, we have different values and value systems, okay? So in terms of those value systems, there are two value systems that Wested did a study on, and that they could be contradicting in terms of what the school messages are and in terms of what the home and the family messages are, in terms of the value and the communication, okay? And so in this aspect, right, how do we support meaningful interaction with the parents and the families in order for us to build upon that expectation, okay, and that communication with the family. So these are considered in terms of individualism or collectivism, okay? And so the critical part here is making schools, as it says here, places where all children can learn, is from educators is to see their own cultural values in the classroom, okay? And so I'd like you to do a little activity here. On page 5, we will come back to the bridge, but right now on page 5 on the bottom, you have two sets of values, okay? On one column, you have 5 statements of the sets of values, and on the other column, you have another set of values, okay? So what I'd like for you to do is read these, okay? So fostering independence and individual achievement, that's one value. And then on the other side, number 1 says fostering interdependence and group success. And what I want you to think about this, not necessarily you as a professional, but you as in your family, okay? So, because you might, when I did this for myself, I thought of myself as a professional, and it was a little bit different because of we move in and out of our culture, right? And then when I did this as a parent, myself and the way I know and understand my culture, then I saw something different in terms of what I was circling, okay? So again, the frame I'd like for you to have for this is which one? Your family, okay? Think about if you have kids, think about what kinds of values do you install in your kids? How are your conversations about them in terms of what's important, what's valuable in each one of these statements. One key aspect is don't think about it too much, right? Don't analyze it. Just like there's no right or wrong answer, just you may go in and out of some of these, and some of these I found I put a circle and then a little arrow to the other side and vice versa. Just so that, but just wherever you land that is more comfortable, okay? That feels more true to you. Any questions? Okay, thank you. On this column, we have more of the value system that is identified through the study of West Ed and working with classroom teachers and students and finding out through looking at the practices as to which one is which. So individualism or collectivism, maybe you found that it's a combination, but it's important for you to be able to identify that, and then before we dive into the scenarios, the case scenarios that we will be examining. And so, in terms of when I did this, I found that number one, fostering interdependence and group success. So we have that a lot in my family. So with the 5 of us, my husband, and my 3 children, we talk a lot about, and we have family meetings, where my boys don't like it, but it's still part of what we say. It's a family activity and we will do it together. And we talk about if one of us is not doing well, then none of us are doing well, because we are an equipo, we are a team. And so where do I get that from? Well, I get that from my family, okay? I come from a large family where there's 11 of us. And so we talk about that and we stay in close communication, because there's also that, you notice probably with families, that they will ask, especially the Latino families, they will ask you, ¿Cómo se porta, right? How is he doing? How are they behaving, right? Because think about that collectivism in terms of they're an extension of who you are, and they're representing you outside of the home. So it's part of that system of thinking and valuing. So I'd like for you to think about what you notice. Were there any surprises in terms of when you looked at this for yourself? And please take the next 2 minutes to talk among each other about what you notice and how you can connect this to your work.
We don't need to duplicate what we can all pull together and benefit from together as a family. And when one of us is down, we all race to support each other. And my children are all college age, and we still do a group text every day. And in fact, my son just announced that he was offered a job in the group text just about 2 seconds ago, and we're all just chiming in and celebrating with him. So.
Well, that's interesting, because I chose the individualism, but I wasn't thinking it in that manner, because my family, we do the same thing. We group text 10 times a day, and we're sharing everything. But I was thinking more as I was raised, we were supposed to, work for, to better yourself for the family, if that makes sense. Every generation should do better, and so you had to work to help to raise that piece, and so I thought of that as individualism, but it's really about bringing the whole family with you. So that's interesting.
Yeah, some of these questions I was a little bit divided on. Question number 3, the 2 options, one associated with egalitarian relationships and one associated with stable hierarchical roles. I was conflicted on that, because the one that's associated with stable hierarchical roles, such as gender, family background, and age, is part of collectivism, and I didn't really see it, I didn't read it in that light. I saw that as being very prescriptive of your destiny and your role in the family, and that definitely is not we do not assign, chores by gender,
Right.
traditional, associations. So I chose the other one on that one.
So you might have noticed that it's not necessarily one or the other, that it's also depending on the situation, right? So one other example that I'd like to share with you is we were camping as a family, and we went to a lake, and there was in the middle of the lake, there was this platform, and there was a structure to slide into the water, okay? And so we were all, in line, and we would go up the ladder and then slide down and fall into the water. And there was this little girl that, I don't know, I think she might have been 5 years old. And she decided to go and have that excitement like everybody else. And the father was with her. Well, this little girl started to panic in the middle of the ladder. And there's a line, right? And the line is waiting. And the father is coaching and saying, you can do this. Come on, sweetie. You really want to do this. I know. And then he would coach her. And then he started to say, do you want to or not? And then she was like, I do want to. Okay, so let's keep going, right? And so the line kept on getting longer and longer. And me, the collectivism in me is looking like, okay, so how is this? How are we going to deal with this, right? And just thinking about like, okay, and part of me was admiring the coaching by the father, and part of me was having this anxiety because the line kept getting longer and longer, right? But it made me reflect. If I were that parent, what would I say to my child? And in the value system of collectivism, I would have told my child, frankly, I would have loved to coach my child, heard this parent coach his daughter, but frankly, I would have said, okay, sounds like you're not ready. How about, look at all these nice people waiting for you. How about we come back when you are ready, okay? So what happened was that the father was successful at coaching his daughter. She went up the ladder, and then once she saw at the height and all the water, guess what? Panic again. And so then the next step was the uncle came around at the bottom of where the water was and started to cheer her up and say, you can do this. And they brought the floatable that she liked, a pizza. It was great. And so guess what? She did it. And not only that, but everyone that was in line, including myself, applauded and cheered for that little girl. Isn't that wonderful? Yes. So it is, that kind of dynamic in terms of how working with the individualistic, right? And that's that individualism in terms of focus on this child, but at the same time how the collective worked because of that father not giving up, right? So I think that's a good example of how we can also now read about the classroom aspect, okay? And so in one article, actually it's a study, it's more than an article, but in this brief, and you have this as a resource, I will walk you through an activity where we will look at, there's 7 scenarios in terms of the perception and the valuing and how we do things in our system, and how maybe because of our personal value, if it's more in the individualism, we may not be able to understand and bridge into how that parent may be looking at things from a different perspective, just like I was, as in, we will come back, right? It's not that I don't value my child having that experience, it's just that the collectivism in me is thinking about the rest of the group, right? So those dynamics happen in the classroom. So we will experience with 4 of the scenarios. And so what in the 4 scenarios that I've selected is, I selected for us to review a child as an individual versus a child as part of a group. in the classroom. And so you will read through the context for it. You will read about how, in this scenario, so the situation, the context, and then what's a set of strategies that can be used to support that dance between supporting the individualism that is part of maybe the culture, and then also that collectivism that may be coming from the home. And it's not only from immigrant families, but also several, like African American families also foster more of the collectivism type of culture, Native American culture, so it's a broader conversation here. So we will dive into one of these four. So we have number one. We will also explore with number three in terms of praise to promote self-esteem versus criticism to achieve normative behavior, because those are key in terms of how easily we can interpret that parent is not being supportive, right? The other is number six, teacher's role. That includes the socializing, or the parent's role that includes the teaching, and how those two may be of conflict. And the last one is sharing, okay? So sharing versus personal property, and how those dynamics of the classroom could be set for success, okay? For our students to not feel like they have to compromise part of who they are and the messages and the values they have from the home, that they can also see those in the classroom, okay? All right, so before we do that, I thought we would see some cartoons, right? So this one, it says, it's hard to pick out just one stalk. And the other one is, yeah, they all sort of blend together, don't they? Right, so in terms of understanding the different pieces, or another way of looking at it is the grain that survives until harvest goes here, and then now the grains really blend together, and from here to the mill where they become flour, right? So it's on the perspective, right, in terms of what's most important for that. Not meant to be a joke, I guess. Okay, all right. So I think it's most important that we get to our scenarios, yes? Okay, because after you read this scenario, you will read about the situation, you will read about the context, and then what strategies are connected to that specific situation, okay? And so then you will have time to discuss among each other. And the goal is to get you to create a poster that will give us more information. But I'm thinking that if anything, if we don't get to the poster, if at least you get to really discuss how you make sense out of this strategy, and then elaborate in that part, okay? Does this make sense? Okay. Whenever you're ready, as a team, I'd like to invite you to discuss your notes with your small group, that you refer to specific details from the example provided. And if you have any additional ideas or thoughts or questions, that you can also add these to the notes. If you select to do this as a collective, that's great. If you say, well, let's do some partner talk, that works as well. But we have the next 5 minutes to do that, okay? All right.
Let me also help you to understand in the classroom why this might be a positive thing for them, right? So I always feel like there's a balance point. It's like you don't ignore the culture, but you also don't ignore the learning that the child could potentially gain from that. And if the parent understands it, it can be a positive thing rather than a source of discomfort or something like that. So.
I wrote that, like, under strategy, I wrote it's a sort of compromise. You take into account the culture, but you also have to take into account the goals for the student. So it's kind of just similar to what you wrote.
I was just wondering if at the beginning of the school year, the teacher could survey the parents saying, what are you hoping that your child learns or achieves in the classroom? And in this case, if the father had had reported, I want her to be well behaved, then the teacher would know that that's a value and could have opened with, your daughter is very well behaved and very respectful and is learning a lot. And then that would have allowed the parent potentially to now be willing to listen to hear more about what the teacher had to say.
Kind of using the terms that you know is important to them if the child is actually doing that. I'm going to get rid of this thing.
I just like the part that it said that the praise needs to be balanced. You know, that it says with suggestions for improvement coming from, hearing, when we do evaluations, it's like, oh yeah, I like to hear what I'm doing well, but how can I do better? If I'm seeing that I could be a 5, and I'm at a 4, tell me what I need to do to get there. And I'm pretty sure the parent, felt the same way. It was like, okay, she's doing great, but how could she do better, Anybody else?
I just kind of grabbed it.
I just think that when working with teachers, we want to balance this because some response might be, okay, well then I'm just not going to praise anybody. Like that kind of feeling like, well, I don't know when I'm supposed to do it and not supposed to do it. So I think couching it with some of the suggestions that you said, like, here's a survey at the beginning of the year, find out what parents want from their kids. Because I think how it started to go down, there's other ways that kids can talk or not respond in a speaking way, but that's what we want them to practice the language and use the language. And so I think, as you mentioned as well, helping parents understand how these are positive attributes in the class and not just her talking too much. But I think it's important to also not to immediately think negatively of the parent, which was kind of the scenario like, oh, he must not care. It's like, no, well, let's ask the question and let's get at that. So I think just when using this with teachers is kind of not make them feel like you have to go the extreme the other way. But it really does get back to that relationship building piece.
Okay, so I'd like to ask that you have one member from your team just share out very in a succinct manner what the situation was and what was the strategy, in terms of for yours, just for the sake of everybody hearing about the 4 scenarios and taking that with you. And so it's we don't have a lot of time, so it's very succinctly in terms of this is the situation and this is the powerful piece in terms of how this strategy worked. Got it? Who wants to go first? And I ask that you take the mic and you stand up, please, and then share out. Awesome. Okay. And that way you get to hear from the 4. Okay.
Cafeteria in the morning, the mothers were eating breakfast with their children, feeding the children, as well as giving food to the other children. The school was upset about it. They put up a sign that said no parents allowed. The parents protested. Power to the people. And so the strategy that the school came up with was having other activities that involved food, that they could share experience, and then also talking about with the teachers that they could have tasks in the classroom where the children could be collective helping, and also room monitors and having more than one.
Number 3, and so the situation is where sorry, I drew a blank here. So when parents don't follow school suggestions, example, a notice is being sent home and they're being asked to support their student academically. And so in this situation, the parents, let's just say immigrant parents, were like, well, they can't be supporting academically because they, one, don't know the language, or home is for socializing and discipline and school is for teaching. And so the strategy was bridging that culture by creating a volunteer program that encouraged everyone to be on campus and supporting in any task that they can. And one of the things we were just saying at one of the school sites is just as simple as taking crafts home and like cutting for the teachers. So also by being on campus, they too can learn the language along with their children. And so, yeah.
Okay, so our scenario is a parent-teacher conference with a father who has more collectivism, attitudes and the teacher who is more individual. And so she's telling him how great the student is doing, and the parent is getting very uncomfortable and upset and is very concerned the child is acting up in class, and there's kind of this just communication disconnect. Teacher ends up kind of feeling like the parent doesn't care, so it turns into kind of a difficult situation. And of course, the strategies for doing that is to kind of find balance between the praise and the criticism. And I think actually people in this group had some good things, right? Watch our assumptions that they don't care the way they're doing it, but also like knowing the culture would help them to say words like your daughter is very respectful in the class. The daughter pays attention. They, that kind of stuff. So all the things that that they might want to have. And then they allow some flexibility. And they provide alternatives, writing in journals and things like that. So we were talking about how we bump each other up.
So our scenario is that most Latino immigrant families share possessions. So there's no really question about in the morning getting the shirt from your brother or your sibling in the drawer without asking for permission. So the situation here is that in a school setting, even though the material is for the school, usually it is seen per student. So how can we avoid having that conflict that this type of community does share things without even really having to ask? So the strategy is to teachers can use this opportunity to share the cultural norms, such as sharing, and that it is important that even though we do have our individual items, we do can all share. And an example was that when a student needed a pencil or a ruler, students were ready to offer and to share with them that.
So just thinking about what everyone said, Inez had a really great quote that she said, and she said, "When you understand the people, you understand the culture."
So in terms of key considerations to build cultural and linguistic bridges, number one, as students, learning is improved when educators understand and honor the attitudes, values, norms, and beliefs of the students' culture, their culture. Number two, understanding how a person's cultural lens influences in interactions can encourage family engagement. Then number three, considering how various cultures view education and schooling practices can promote engagement. Number four, educators' beliefs about family and community engagement are critical to their success in working productively with families. And number five, which is the most important, the process to cultural competence starts with the individual, and it is a personal journey. So with that, I'd like to end almost on the last thought. And I wanted to give you a little bit of mathematics, just to mix it up a little bit. So we are in what year? 2019. And in 1776, something very important happened. July 4, what did we do? United States. It marks the United States independence. The independence was signed. So that gives the United States of America how many years as a sovereign nation? 243 years, if I did the math right. Okay, is correct? Good, we have some math people in the room. Then I have another year. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And so that, and the Brown versus Board of Education is the landmark decision of the US Supreme Court of American laws about racial segregation in our schools, okay? So it made it unconstitutional. So that gives us 65 years of really having to work with our diversity and having to be able to do our very best and keep working at getting better, okay? So with that, I invite you to keep making history. And I'm going to share a quote by of the Constitution of the 5 Nations, okay, Native American. So it says, "Look and listen for the welfare of the whole people, and have always in view not only the present, but also the coming generations. even those whose faces are yet beneath the surface of the earth, the unborn of the future nation. Okay? So, lastly, if you look at the criteria, success criteria, you may check one of those off. If we were able to accomplish one of those tonight, we did well. Okay, so thank you.